Mt Barney is situated in the scenic rim of southeast Queensland as part of the Focal Peak group. The rock type is a granite variant based on rhyolite lavas that have cooled underground and become exposed later on. The mountain is comprised of two main 1300 metre peaks plus a group of other satellite peaks, one of which is Isolated Peak or Northeast Rock on some maps. This is a trip I did in 2020 to Isolated Peak using the southeastern ridge for access. I'd been on a recce 2 days before to the northeastern ridge, and I'd seen that walking the approach ridge to the peak was all fairly straightforward. My basic approach method was to get into Rocky Creek from the lower Portals Trail, walk around 100 metres upstream to a junction of two creeks. The ridge in between those two creeks leads all the way to Isolated Peak. In this view from the northeastern ridge, we can see Rocky Creek, the junction, and the line of the access ridge. In this approach, I would be getting onto the southeastern ridge where it begins in bushland. About halfway along the access ridge, I crossed the creek to the south to meet up with the beginning of the southeastern ridge. There's a large rock in this vicinity that I use as a helpful marker. I like to get onto this ridge nice and early as the creek gullies get steeper as we approach the mountain. After about a kilometre, grassy slopes lead up to the first rocks, and in this approach they appear quite suddenly. The slopes here are of the same grade as those on the northeast ridge, but each ridge has its own characteristics. I remember there being some big slabs on this side. Isolated Peak is one of the steepest on the mountain and is quite demanding to climb. In this view we can see that the northeast ridge climbs steeply and directly to the peak, while the southeast ridge takes a more roundabout course. The southeast ridge has two approaches, and this is the steeper of the pair. The ridge is comprised of two rocky knolls and the large shoulder section to the south of the peak. My initial approach was to climb these steep slabs and the gravel channels between them, first to this overhang and then through this awkward bottleneck with a tree jammed in it. Camera footage tends to downplay a situation, and although I wouldn't describe this slope as overly hard, I couldn't describe it as easy either. The main considerations in this section, and over the whole route, are the steepness of the slabs, the slipperiness of the gravel, and the high frequency of large loose rocks that are encountered. Above the approach slabs are the two knolls. This is the view on the approach to the first knoll, and in this section was a cairn. On my right I could see along the northeast ridge. The second knoll is gotten to by passing through the gap below. Beyond there a slope leads up and the natural route runs left of the bluff top. From here we have a good view of the top of the northeast ridge, and it's obviously not easy there. Now an enormous bluff end that leads to the upper shoulder of the peak is visible ahead. We can see that this ridge is very direct, but a couple of steep sections have to be crossed. I've heard of people using this ridge, especially to descend, but I've never been that way myself. This view faces the bluff end, and we can see the crack up the centre is the obvious line of progress. I've often contemplated how to get through this part, and have come to the conclusion that throwing a rope over the tree at the top would be the easiest way. This spot has an amazing feeling, and I always love to stop for a rest here. This is looking back along the ridge. And here we can see that the northeast shoulder is way below us now. This is the general line and the angle of the northeast ridge, with Mount Maroon behind. And above we see the jutting overhangs of the bluff end. My intention today is to use the route I'm familiar with, a route that traverses around the left of this whole section. In this view we can see that the route gradually ascends during the traverse, and also that the entire crossing is quite long. As we can see, the slopes on this side are very, very steep, and the first part of the traverse is definitely risky. The route I usually take first descends to where slabs will allow upward travel. Then open rock and gravel channels are ascended until progress is impeded by the steepness of the grade. This section is zigzagged through by climbing right. Above there, a final steepest slab is crossed to easier ground. The rest of the traverse is across ledges and through rocks and scrub, and the route tops out on Eagles Ridge just below the shoulder of Isolated Peak. Just taking it easy and going really slowly. From the bluff end, as I said, I would first descend to where slabs allow upward travel. The slopes here are all at 45 degrees. From then on, I just climbed slabs where they would let me through, moving from safe spot to safe spot. Video never gives a clear impression of the actual steepness, but there's very little room for error in the first part of this crossing. The slabs tend to become steeper as progress is gained, and this is the section leading up to the zigzag. The rough surfaces of the rock give good grip here and allow for gradual progress. Up higher though, the section to be bypassed is a very smooth slab, which is slightly overhung and therefore quite risky. I begin the zigzag by climbing to the right. As we can see, there's only a few meters to cross, but it's quite awkward here. I'm passing beneath a bulge in the rock face. Of course, I'm using the camera at the moment, but this will be my other handhold and also the pivot point to get across. Once the zigzag is overcome, a ledge leads up to the final steep slab. This is the top of the same slab that I've just bypassed, but here at least it has the virtue of a few knobbles to grip onto. In this shot, I'm halfway up it, standing in a gravelly crack. Looking back, the camera downplays the steepness, but I give fair warning once again, this section is no picnic. But after that, the rest of the traverse is much safer. Further passage is found through these channels, although there's a lot of loose rock, sometimes stacked in piles ready to collapse. The route runs beneath an enormous cliff wall, and a little further on I'm funneled into a narrow channel created by a large block. This is climbed as a chimney and is about the halfway point. Despite the slabs still looking very precipitous, there are lots of safe ledges here. And there's a lot to see as well, such as this view of East Peak. I'll just take a few moments to recollect on some earlier trips. Looking up at North Peak, this angle of view allows me to reminisce of when I did a circuit of the summit here. In that trip, I climbed North Ridge, and part of the descent was through these vegetated channels. These channels are a viable route, and ended up being quite straightforward. It was getting back onto the ridge that proved to be a little difficult, but not impossible. Here are some pictures from that journey. This is early in the traverse, looking across to North Ridge, which is peeking around the corner. Here's a shot of the cliffs traversed beneath, also the home of stroppy peregrine falcons. And this is the general view back to Isolated Peak from there. This is where I chose to rejoin North Ridge, and it brought me out just above the bottom of the ramp section. And just across to the right from there, the most challenging section of Eagles Ridge is also visible. This part of the ridge is so steep and awkward that a lot of traversing and zigzagging is required to get through it. Here we see down from the top of that section. And this is an example of the general grade of the slopes and the smoothness of the slabs. The weeping wet areas add another degree of slipperiness. And a little further right, we can see the steepest part of the approach to Leaning Peak as well. Both short and long leaning ridges meet up at a pinnacle below the summit block here. Then this steep section has to be overcome, and it's even steeper than the sections I've just crossed. Again, here's another picture from over there. In this image, I'm standing below that slope looking up at it, and the small traverse just here has to be taken with great care. As we can see, there's only a few meters to cross, but the slope below it is very unforgiving. This is the higher approach to the summit. And here's the view from the top back to Isolated Peak. On the other side of Leaning Peak are a set of abseil shackles to help with the 30-metre drop. Unfortunately I can't abseil, so I went back down the way I came up. And returning to the current traverse, I make my way along slopes like these, and also through the obvious rocky channels. The cliffs on my right are still very sheer. Later in the crossing we can see down to the saddle between North Peak and Isolated Peak. And this is looking back along the route. By now I'm absolutely filthy with dirt and charcoal. This is the approach to the ridge crest and has the steepest climbing yet, although it's not as risky here because the exposure has lessened. Look at that, great start. The section is steep but easy. I'm able to climb with one hand and have the camera in the other. This is also the line of Eagle's Ridge, and I notice a few footprints in the mud. And finally I reach the top of the traverse. It's only a short ascent now to the shoulder section. The way leads up along a series of rocky steps and ramps. From the top of the shoulder, the summit block is seen to the north. And to the south we see the Barney skyline. The slopes of the Moonlight Slabs heading down to Mt Barney Creek. And this is looking back down the southeast ridge. Here I stop for refreshments and a fly of the drone. In this pullback shot, we get a general idea of the terrain here and the reason that Isolated Peak is named, as it stands alone in the massif. And looking back to the south, we can see across the areas I described from the earlier trips. These are the vegetated channels on the circuit of North Peak. And here's where I rejoined North Ridge. A little to the right we can see the most challenging section of Eagle's Ridge. And down below we can see the rock outcrops in the saddle between North and Isolated Peaks. This is the approach to Leaning Peak, which I also described earlier, and we can see that it's very steep there. And once again we see the sharp profiles of this section of the mountain. Now to get around the summit block. The right-hand side, which is the top of the northeast ridge, is pretty much impassable from here. But on the left, a set of rocky steps is the safer way up. From there it's just a short walk through the scrub to the top. Once there, I wasted no time in getting the drone up again for a quick selfie as the day was getting on. And then I returned to matters at hand, and the saying goes that there's no easy way up Mt Barney, well, there's often no easy way down either. And the options for descending include returning to the south and climbing down to the Eagles Ridge saddle and then following the creek bed out to the east from there. This is probably the safest way and the way that I should have gone today. Descending the southeast ridge with the help of rope seems possible, and I want to try this one day. Returning along the inward route is a definite possibility, and at least has the virtue of being familiar. A descent of the upper northeast ridge is probably beyond my capabilities, so I won't go that way. Off to the west, the slopes lead down to Mt Barney Creek, but this is the opposite direction to where I want to go. In the end, I decided to descend Eagles Ridge to the north, down towards the attractive cluster of peaks at Tom's Tum. My big idea is to descend here and go down one of the gullies between Tom's Tum. This is the slope that I descended along on the north side of Isolated Peak, and it's quite tricky to negotiate. I pretty much just followed the contours of the slope where it would let me through, and this is the route that eventuated. In the initial descent, I encountered a lot of loose rock, and the slope is a lot steeper than it appears in this view. I descended to about here, where cliffs barred further progress. I was gradually funneled to the other side of the ridge until I reached a set of lightly forested rocks. The slopes are steep on both sides here, but I could see a terrace below, so I down-climbed this section using the rope 3 times in the scrambling style. On the way down, I was fairly reliant on the rope. I don't think I could have down-climbed without it. The section was so awkward I had to climb back up a small way to get to the terrace. Once again I encountered sheer slopes. From there I was led slightly to the other side of the ridge until I reached what appeared to be the top of a dry waterfall. This ended up being a line of erosion from one of the rock belts that are seen in various places on the mountain. Another of these rock belts is the Staircase Formation on South Ridge, and I know of another in Rocky Creek below North Ridge. I descended this using the rope twice, and then a shelf let me back onto the main ridge line. From there the slopes were steep but manageable, and I descended to the saddle just before Tom's Tum. My next big idea was to descend east from the saddle here, and then try and make my way around to the northeast ridge of Isolated Peak. This did work out in the long run, but was such hard work that I don't think I'd come this way again. I basically descended into a gorge full of loose rock, and then had to traverse across 3 creek gullies filled with debris to reach the northeast ridge. From the saddle, after a short descent, I reached a tall, smooth slab at the head of the creek, and I used the rope to get to the bottom of it. Now turning back from here. Down below, loose rock had collected over the ages, and the going was quite difficult for the next 300 metres. Here's an example of the type of terrain crossed. And needless to say, by this point in the day, my legs were very tired. Ooh. This looks like the bottom-ish. Despite the hard work, it was definitely a pleasant moment when I stepped into an area of unburnt forest that had survived the fires. After a little more rock hopping, the gorge walls got lower and I began a traverse to the right. I didn't get much steady footage of the gully crossings, but again here's an example of the terrain encountered. And finally, I stumbled out onto the familiar top of the northeast ridge. It had been an excellent journey to a very special part of the mountain. I'm just going to peg it back. It was a great day. So thanks for joining me. Adios.